As you all know, we are living in really unprecedented time. This pandemic has cascading effect, of course, on the economy, the financial situation, the social situation, and of course, a great effect on the population as such. A large part of our population is in financial hardship or in financial stress. Actually, this situation has really stressed the importance of financial literacy in supporting financial resilience. I think it has also stressed the cost, again, of financial illiteracy, something very important for us, the financial literacy community. I also do believe that there are a few silver linings, actually, in this crisis. First, maybe for a short while, our planet is a bit greener. Perhaps some of us are refocusing on the essential in our lives, and a bit of a personal touch, a bit less traveling, a bit less jet lag, that's good as well. And of course, digital advances means that we can most of the time stay connected virtually and allows us actually to host this kind of webinar. It is actually a decision at the OECD to stay connected, especially on topical issues and also on financial literacy and financial resilience. We have decided to organize a series of webinars, either because us, the OECD, are producing important piece of research, or because there is an important piece of research that is being developed out there. And this is the case today. I'd like to say that this is the first, this kind of webinar that we are organizing as a series for the INFE. And I do believe it is a critically important webinar. Why? Because when we actually decided to create the International Network of Financial Education back in 2008, one of the 3 goals of that network was to look at the effectiveness of financial education. And this is typically what this piece of research is doing. This is something that has been, that all the committee has been waiting for a long time. So we are very excited to be able to offer you that webinar today. And I'm actually very glad, honored, and proud to have these 2 renowned presenters for us today. So let me introduce them. And I have to say I'm a bit emotional, and I'll tell you why in a minute. But first, let me present, of course, Annamaria Lusardi. I'd like to say that Anna is really what I believe the financial literacy star. And as such, she has many hats. Of course, as all of you know, perhaps in this seminar, first, she is the chair of the INFE Research Committee, and it has been a very important position for us at the INFE for many years. But she's also the founder and academic director of GFLAG. And as such, she's been really the financial literacy research guru. She's really been instrumental in making sure that financial literacy is established as an academic field, and that's been extremely important. But she also has the policy angle. She's actually the director of the Italian Financial Education Committee, which is in charge of the development of the national strategy for financial education in Italy. And actually, in recognition of all this achievement, I'm very, I would say, almost proud, very happy for her that she's been promoted university professor at the George Washington University. It is a very well-deserved promotion, a long career, a lot of achievements, and I'm sure she will do more and she will continue to surprise us. In normal times, we would have celebrated properly. Today, I can only do this, Anna, if you flowers, because digital, but that's the best I can do today. And I hope that all attendees are joining me in congratulating you once again. Really well done. Today, Anna is presenting us what I think is a really important piece of research, together with one of the main co-authors of that piece of research. And we are very happy to welcome him as well in this webinar. Tim Kaiser is an assistant professor of economics and economics education at the University of Koblenz-Landau, and is a research associate at the German Institute for Economic Research at the IW Berlin. His recent research is very relevant for that group. He is really focusing recently on experimental impact evaluation of financial education programs in developing countries, as well as evaluation of economic education in schools in OECD countries. So very, very, very relevant area of research for this group. But now, with no further ado, I'd like to give the floor to both Anna and Tim to deliver their presentation. They will have more or less 30 minutes. After that, they will answer questions. Again, if you would like to ask them questions, you can start doing so by using the chat function at the bottom of the screen. Now, Anna, over to you.
Thank you so much, Florence, for your kind word. I'm very excited to be here with Tim to present our work today. Let me share the screen. The topic we are going to address, it's a very important question, of course, and it's a simple one, but difficult to answer, which is, does financial education work? And as you have mentioned, this is an even more important question at this time of crisis. And many countries around the world, Italy did one in 2017, have designed national strategies for financial literacy. And of course, it's very important to rely on data and evidence. But what does the evidence say? It's important because what has happened is the research on financial literacy and financial education has exploded. And I think very much due to the leadership of the OECD in its INFE, the work we see now is present in all of the countries, and it's a very remarkable amount of work. I'm also very happy to say that financial literacy has officially become a field of research. More recently, the Journal of Economic Literature had a code for this field. Please use G53, all of you researchers, when you are studying financial literacy. As a result, when we look at so much work, how can we summarize all of it? This is the questions, and the first issue we face when together, not just with Tim, but Carly Urban and Lukas Menkhoff, it takes a really large group of researchers to address these questions because we are facing with so much evidence. I did earlier a review of the existing literature. It was back in 2014, and back then, more than 6 years ago, it was easier to do such an analysis. It's not anymore because we have literally thousands of papers. So what we are going to do and what we did in this paper is a meta-analysis, which is a more systematic and quantitative literature review of all of the existing evidence on addressing this important question, which is looking at the effect of financial education. We did this also because that was the approach done by the first, in a sense, paper who faced such a questions back in 2014. A group of researchers as well published a meta-analysis of the work existing since then. And I have to say 3 more meta-analyses have been published since that original work published in Management Science in 2014. But that meta-analysis has played a very important role in the field of financial education. And interestingly, it has been cited for the 2 major findings or statements made in the introduction of that work, which is that, and I want to quote here, they claim, the paper says, intervention to improve financial literacy explains 0.1% of the variance in financial behavior studied. And I think this is equivalent, or people have interpreted to say financial education doesn't seem to have an effect. There's certainly a very minuscule effect. And also that the effect of financial education decays over time, and the explicit kind of idea behind this, if there is such a decay, potentially it might be much better to do just-in-time financial education. Well, this paper has been very influential, and I'm sure it has affected the field of financial education, but it has certainly affected the view in the media about financial education. And since then, we just collected a few articles that discuss, in a sense, this topic. And as you can see, over time, people are asking the same question, which is, but if, does it really work? And if it doesn't work, are we wasting time? Why forcing students, for example, to study financial education in school and so on? Why have institutions devoted to financial education? So analysis and papers are very important, and of course, we need to take seriously the evidence, and it has taken seriously, we can say, and that's why it's important to continue to have a discussion about this. It's important, and I think the next graph is one of the things that shows visually why it's so important that we update the evidence, because first of all, that first meta-analysis was published in 2014. It covers paper published up to 2013. And as you can see here, this is a very small part of the existing work on financial education. So we need to see what has happened since then. And the bulk of the research actually happened much after 2014. And probably the paper that were reviewed were very different than the paper that were published later. So in our work, we try to follow the same, in a sense, procedure. And what we did, faced with so much evidence, we decided to focus on the most rigorous studies, which are the randomized controlled trials. So these are literally experiments like you do in hard sciences, where you have a control group that you don't do anything, and then a treatment group that is treated with financial education. And we can see what is the effect of financial education. This is the golden, in a sense, standard for that. And we wanted to focus on the rigorous studies, and we ended up having in our analysis, because so much work has been done across countries, in our sample we have as many as 33 countries versus, for example, the original paper, the original meta-analysis. So you can see, we have so much more data, so much more evidence across countries. We also see that our sample now has a lot of low-income countries, experiment done in those countries, also on low-income individuals. So a lot of the evidence shows that if you treat people which have more resource constraint, you might be able to find less effect. Also, because the evidence seems to suggest that there is this sharp decay, or there is a decay in financial education. On average, we measure the effect of financial education in all this paper after 30 weeks. So when we look at our evidence, and we were just examining the composition of our sample, we thought, we are going to not only replicate the initial result, but we will find even less evidence of financial education, if there is anything at all. But let me preview what we did find. In our most updated data set, our results are very different than the original meta-analysis. We find that the estimate of the effect of financial education, and we are going to document both on financial knowledge and on behavior, is from 3 to 5 times larger. So the size of the estimate really increased a lot. And we don't find much evidence or strong evidence in support of this decay of the effect of financial education. Let me explain how we got to this and what we did in our work. It's actually very complicated to do a meta-analysis. It has a lot of, I think, advantages because, contrary to basically getting all of the paper and reading them carefully and try to understand whether there is a common theme, we select, and we decided to select all of the existing evidence, but the most rigorous one. As a result, we have a rich sample. And also, I wanted to tell you that one other good result we saw here is that many papers are now published in top economics journal. And this shows, first of all, how much this field has expanded, and also how rigorous these papers are. To publish in top economic journal, it takes a lot of time, care, attention. It's very complicated. Not only, but because we have a larger sample, we are going to look at a set of behavior. So for example, we can look at borrowing, saving, budgeting, and so on. So we are, for example, much better able to zoom in this important question of, does financial education work? Our analysis is meticulous, and this is a word I want to underline, meaning that because we have so much data, we had to be extremely careful as well of taking into consideration the large differences that exist across studies. You know, here we are, and I just want to, in a sense, make you understand what we had to do. You know, we have so many papers, they are all doing many different things, right? Some are looking, for example, at saving behavior. Some are looking at young people. Some are looking at treating, for example, low-income individuals who, for example, do remittances in other countries. And we had to aggregate all of this evidence. We need to take into consideration, of course, the major differences that can exist when you look at as many as 33 countries. Also, you know, the model you use to do the meta-analysis is, of course, sensitive to the assumption you make. And this is why we have written a paper which is more than 80 pages long, because we are very careful about all of the assumption, making sure that these assumptions are justified, and also we do a lot of robustness check. We also are aware that, for example, editors prefer to publish papers that have effects versus no effect. And so we have also taken into consideration publication biases. You know, we have a lot of, in a sense, different groups, and so we do a lot of subgroup analysis as well. So, you know, we try to dissect and study this topic in many details, and the details are provided in the paper. What we also do, and this is different from previous meta-analysis, we are interested in calculating the economic size of the estimate. You know, I don't know what to say or how to interpret that estimate do not explain, there is little variance explain. What does the variance explain really mean? What I'm interested as a policymaker or as an academic is, well, what is the size effect? You know, does financial education move behavior a lot or a little? And most importantly, is it cost effective? You know, of course we can move behavior, but if it takes a lot of money to influence behavior, well, perhaps we cannot do that. So this is why in our analysis, we focus on this important question, is it cost effective? So here we go, and we are ready to plunge, in a sense, in describing our meta-analysis. So I want to remind you, in a sense, how a meta-analysis is done and explain it first in word, and then I give it to Tim to explain, in a sense, in more rigorous term. And of course, the rigorous part is going to be a lot more formal and a lot more mathematical. But, you know, what we are trying to do is basically put together, we are collecting all of these papers that study financial education and the effect of financial education. We want to do it in the most, in a way that we can really assess causality. And that's why we only choose the randomized control trial. But then here we are, we have to aggregate studies that, for example, are looking, in some cases, they look at saving rate. In some cases, we look at saving amount. How do we compare that, right? We cannot compare pear and apples. Outcome might vary a lot. You know, some might look at very different behavior. There is, of course, different intensity. We are studying intervention that have 1 hour retirement seminar versus a very long and intense program. How do we aggregate them? You know, we can't give them the same weight, of course. You know, we can't just simply sum up and then give you an average. So I'm going to turn now the presentation to Tim, who is going to, you know, really zoom in and give you the technical details of our meta-analysis, because we want to interpret with you the result and the estimate we got. So Tim.
Okay, so yeah, just a quick reminder, this is going to be a bit more technical, but I will try to limit it to the necessary details for you to really understand the estimates that are presented, because it's not that it's very straightforward. As Anna said, studies measure things in different units. So this could be as simple as in a different currency or in a different very kind of operationalization. So what we do here is that we try to deal with this first problem of studies measuring different things in different units by relying on statistical effect sizes, which are in our case standardized mean differences. So this is a distribution-based effect size. I know the formula looks kind of scary, but to give you some intuition, what we're basically trying to do is try to compare the distribution of a control group who did not receive a financial education program. So this would be the blue distribution you see on the lower left-hand corner, to the distribution of the treatment group that has received a financial education program. So that would be the green distribution. And since these are randomized experiments, we are mainly able and interested to say that the difference between the means of these distributions, so this would be the dotted line here, that this is resembling a causal effect. So any difference between these means should be due to the education program and not due to anything else. But still, since studies measure things in different units, we are standardizing this by the standard deviation of these distributions, right? So that's why you see on the right-hand side in the equation, you see the difference in means, the MT, which would be the mean of the treatment group, minus the MC, which would be the mean of the control group, relative to the standard deviation of this outcome that we are studying, okay? So the outcome could be a test score, such as a PISA result, which would be nicely normally distributed, but it could also be the distribution of savings of the respondents. And sometimes it may make sense to standardize against only one standard deviation of the control group, but here it's a bit more complicated to get rid of some biases. So for you to maybe contextualize this, so suppose we do an experiment on school-based financial education programs, and the main outcome of interest would be the PISA financial literacy assessment. So this is what we are measuring in the end. The students would take the test. So since the PISA financial literacy assessment is scaled to have a mean of 500 and a standard deviation of 100 points, if we arrive at a standardized mean difference of 0.2 SD units, in this case, this would resemble a difference of 20 points in this PISA test. So maybe also if you remember the magnitudes, if you look at country ratings, you can get a sense of the size of the difference when we talk about 1/5 of a standard deviation or effects that are smaller than this. So this is some of the things that we have to just accept, that we are not able to aggregate all of this evidence and still discuss the things in the economic units. But at the same time, this allows us to really arrive at a general effect that has to be reported in a scale-free number. So, and also we mentioned that there's, in addition to this problem of things measuring different things, there's also the problem of heterogeneity in the interventions, right? So there could be very intensive classroom education, which would probably result in larger effects, or it could be a very brief intervention. There could be large differences in the media used or the material. Teachers can be well prepared, or it's the first time for them teaching a course. So any formal meta-analysis should probably try to take care of this heterogeneity that one may expect. And our formal model would try to address this, but it's not necessarily a necessary condition for our results. So we're just allowing studies to arrive at different effects that are all equally valid. And we're trying to quantify the degree with which results actually differ, and the degree of why results only differ because we are measuring effects with error. So let me just briefly walk you through this equation. What we're basically trying to estimate here is this beta zero. So that's the ultimate goal of any meta-analysis, to try to arrive at a general effect of some intervention. And we are now interested in the general effect of financial education. So this would be the beta zero. That's what we're trying to estimate. And the data we have comes from the randomized experiments that we have read in the literature. And these randomized experiments, each of them would be the study J. They may report different treatment effects within these studies. So they could all report multiple effects, actually, not only on the knowledge score, but also on a range of behaviors. And now we are saying, okay, probably these estimates of effect, they are imprecisely measured in some cases. There is going to be measurement error. Whenever you do a survey, you're going to introduce some measurement error because you're not sampling the whole population. So these observed effects, the Ys, they are going to vary just because of measurement error. But then again, in the model, we are also acknowledging, okay, they could also vary because there's also substantial differences in the programs. And we are basically allowing in our model to both be true at the same time. So the good thing is we observe the variances, the sampling variances from the data. So that would be the sigma squared, that's the variance, the squared standard error. And we also observe the effects that are reported within the studies. We're going to apply the standardization as I told you before, but we observe that directly from the data. So there's no extra assumption needed. But we don't observe the tau squared, which would be a parameter that is going to quantify the heterogeneity. And when we looked at the data, you need to estimate this from the data with an algorithm that I'm not going to talk about right now. But when we did this, when we tried to estimate this degree of actual heterogeneity in addition to measurement error, we are already quite surprised because we actually found that the majority of the differences between the studies is not due to measurement error. It's because of actual true heterogeneity. So at least 85% of the differences you observe are due to the fact that the programs that you typically study are very heterogeneous. They are different in multiple dimensions. And our model accounts for this. So we are, for the more technical savvy audience, we are reflecting this now in our weighting scheme, because in the end, the idea is to arrive at a weighted average. So you have to give each study a specific kind of weight. You cannot give them all the same weight because there's going to be imprecise measurement in some cases, and there's going to be substantial differences. And this is a bit more complex. So there's this heterogeneity parameter here. This could also be 0. And then there's also a penalty if studies report a large number of effects. That would be the number K. So you have the measurement error in addition to the sampling variance, and also a term that considers the fact that one single study may report a lot of effects. So our end goal is to estimate this beta 0 and also to have some uncertainty around this. So, and if you look at the raw data, you can already see, so this is the raw data that we extracted. There's no model applied here whatsoever. It's just the data as it is. And on the x-axis, you see the effect size in scale-free standardized mean differences. And on the y-axis, you see the precision with which this estimate is estimated. So this is the inverse standard error, which is due to sampling. And you can see already that if you just plot the raw mean without doing anything to the data in this figure, the mean effect on financial behaviors is actually close to 0.1 standard deviation. And the raw mean effect on financial knowledge would be close to 0.2 standard deviation units. So it's 0.186. So that would be resembling 18-point difference, 18 or 19-point difference in the PISA assessment. So that's the raw data without any modeling applied. But as I said, you should probably apply a model and try to really not only rely on the average effect, but also consider the precision and also the heterogeneity. And this is what we are doing here. So in this figure, you can now see our main result of the paper. So the first result on the y-axis, you see the general effect of financial education that we have estimated. And Fernandez et al., which was the first meta-analysis, they actually made the assumption that there's no heterogeneity. So the tau square that I showed you is here constrained to be 0 by definition. So it's just an assumption, kind of a strong assumption. So they said that all of the differences we observe is due to measurement error. This is an assumption you can make, and we actually also made the same assumption for comparison's sake here. But what you can see is within their data, which relies on 13 different randomized trials, the effect back then was estimated to be 0.018 standard deviation units. And the 95% confidence interval actually included the 0. So we couldn't really tell whether this is actually a significant effect. So that's what's reported in their paper. And using their exact same model and the same assumptions, we actually already arrive at an effect of 0.06 or 0.07 standard deviation units, so more than 3 times as large. So this is the same model here based on our results and our data. So these are effects on financial behaviors. And if you now consider the fact that there could be heterogeneity, so programs could be different, which we all know they are, and if you consider this in the model, then you would get an estimate of close to 0.1 standard deviation units, which is actually quite close to the raw mean that I just showed you. So just by looking at this, we can already tell that there's a substantial and significant difference. So none of these confidence intervals of these newer estimates with the newer data come even close to the old estimate reported in Fernandez. So that is good news, but just updating the data alone, you already get a much more favorable result that is maybe worthwhile to discuss. I'm handing back to Anna.
Thank you. And as we have mentioned, we want to study both financial knowledge and financial behavior. We have a lot more data, so we can, for example, look at different behavior. And if you look at the knowledge, as already the raw data was indicating, we see a much larger effect on financial knowledge. If you look at the behavior, of course, the estimate tend to be less precise when we go, for example, to estimate of remittances, where our sample is smaller. But overall, even if you look at different type of behavior from credit, budgeting, saving, insurance, or remittances, we see a positive effect of financial education on behavior. The question is, so what? First of all, we want to put this in perspective, and we compare our estimate to the estimate of other similar interventions. So for example, education intervention in other fields, like math and reading for knowledge, or education intervention in smoking, health intervention, energy conservation. Because I mean, any intervention of course is going to move behavior a little bit, but it's not that you can move everybody in 100%. And we find that our estimates are very similar to what other people are finding in very similar field. Most importantly, we want to assess size. So is this small or big, right? I mean, this is at the end a number in standard deviation. So does it mean it is economic relevant, and in particular, is it cost effective? To do so, we refer to the paper of Kraft, which works in a similar field and has classified this effect according to the size. So if you remember some of our estimate, the one we showed you before, we were in the 0.1, 0.2 range, and according to this classification, we are in the medium, sometime even in the large size effect, when we look at our the financial education intervention. How about the cost? Just to take this reference as evidence of what could be cost effective, if we are cost below $500, these are considered relatively low cost. Above $5,000, they are considered high cost. We don't have as much evidence in the papers that are published now on the cost of doing this education, but I want to show you in the next graph, and look that below 500 is considered low cost. Actually, as you can see here, and we plotted all of the studies that we were able to find that report the cost, they are all below $300. So according to the definition of Kraft, this financial education is normally low cost and potentially cost effective. So, just to summarize the graph that we said, not only financial education is affecting behavior, but it is potentially a medium, if not a large effect, and it is cost effective. I want to also look at a little bit of a subgroup because we have a much richer set of data. So for example, we split our sample, look at the high income country versus other countries. We look at intervention on low income individual, we look across age group, and we look at type of publications. We have considered, for example, in our analysis, also working, for example, just top journal publication to really refer to the just more rigorous and potentially more sophisticated studies. And we also want to zoom in, because we have a lot more data, on whether there is this evidence of decay. And we have intervention that, for example, look at different time horizon. We don't have a lot, in fact, very few papers that go beyond 2 or 3 years of intervention, but we have some that look at this potential long horizon. So just to summarize the evidence of our subgroups, and that's also, again, why the paper is so long. We cut the data through many different ways, and we do an analysis across different groups. We don't find much evidence that the effect varies. In fact, we don't find evidence that it is different across income group, across publications, and we find that financial education works for all age group. And similar, when we look at carefully about the decay, again, we don't have a lot of observations, so we have to be careful here in making statement. We don't find this support that there is a strong decay, and even the original paper of Fernandez was really based on very few observations. So, that decay is a little, probably not a strong finding. In our evidence, we find that the effect of financial education on financial knowledge is estimated to be positive, at least after a year. And we don't have a lot of studies, but the study that we have find that effect, and the effect on behavior is expected to be positive and continue even after 2 years. So, we need a lot more evidence to study longer time horizon, but this is what we have found in our richer data set. So what are the main takeaway of our analysis so far? To go back to the original question, well, does financial education work? We can say yes. Not only it works, but it has a sizable effect. And according to all of our robustness check, it works across different income group, across different countries. And we don't find much evidence that there is a strong decay in the effect, and that therefore we need to do different education, like just-in-time education, if there is such a thing. We also think that policy recommendations should also be based on the estimate. So like, what is the size, what is the effect of financial education? How much does it move behavior? And in particular, is it cost effective? This is, of course, an important topic for a policy. And again, we don't find the strong evidence that there is a decay, and therefore that we need to do education when people are making or are doing decision. We have also learned by looking at so much data that certainly it's important to do more research, and in particular on long-term effectiveness. We really miss, and we couldn't do a more detailed analysis of the effectiveness over time because we don't have that many papers. We also think it's really important that we see also large-scale experiments. The small scale are important, but can they really scale up? And what is the evidence when we do larger experiment? And I want to push everybody to think hard about the cost effectiveness, because it's not just the effectiveness that matter, it's also, does it justify the cost? And I have to say, I am really impressed by how much work we have seen here. And, given that probably, the earlier paper indicated there is no evidence, we were even surprised that there was so much work done on this across so many papers and across so many publications. But now that financial literacy is a field, it's really important that we also have a journal dedicated to that, so that people can, in a sense, and we have also a place where to go and read all of this work, rather than, in a sense, publish in so many different journals. I also have to say, different journals have different requirements. So I can imagine how hard it was, in a sense, to publish in the, say, Journal of Development Economics and in so many different journals as well. Let me conclude coming back to what Florence said at the beginning, which is that more than ever, of course, people need to have the skills and the knowledge to navigate the current landscape. And I think it's the time of crisis that we just realize how important some of this basic knowledge is. And it's just so important to be financially resilient, not just against big shock like the current one, but even the small shock. And financially resilient family can contribute to a more resilient society. And I think our study does indicate that financial education program can contribute to achieve that goal. And I want to leave you with a picture taken from the US. This is the line at the food banks. More or less 2 weeks after the economy shut down, a lot of Americans couldn't put food on the tables, and we saw this huge line of people having to rely on the food banks. This actually speaks of the cost, in a sense, of lack of financial resilience, and it speaks really of the importance of financial education, not just in terms of effectiveness, but in terms of people's lives. And I want to end thanking the great work that the OECD and its INFE is doing to promote financial education around the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anna and team. That was a very interesting presentation, very robust research. I also really like your focus on cost effectiveness, as I told you earlier. I think this is an area that has not been explored and will deserve to be explored more in the future. I agree with you. I see that there are many questions in the chat. I will just allow you to read them. And while you're doing so, we had a question about the presentation and the recording, and as was mentioned in the chat, yes, the webinar is recorded. Yes, the presentation will be available on our website, the OECD website. Perhaps I'll kick off with just one question, and then I'll let you look at the question in the chat and respond to them. So the question is really coming back to your presentation a little bit more and asking you what makes your meta-analysis different from the one developed by Fernandez, well, some years ago, 6 years ago, actually.
I'll start with this and Tim can add more. Certainly what characterizes our work is the larger number of papers we could collect after that, because so much work has been done. And even with respect to the previous meta-analysis that actually was done by Tim and his co-author, we have 1/3 more papers. So my recommendation, by the way, is that given that the speed at which this field is developing, probably we need to continuously look at this evidence. But the other important things is we are considering and taking into account the fact that these studies vary a lot, right? And this is important, how do you aggregate all of these studies? This aggregation is critically important. We have shown it in the formula, in a sense, if you take away that tau square in the weight, you're going to have different weight. So it's critically important to do that. More data allows you also to just do more and cut through, for example, different groups, which were not done in previous work.
Anna, just if I can interject before Tim, there is a question about also Kaiser's and Menkhoff's meta-analysis. So if you can just a few words about the difference with this one as well.
I'll leave that to Tim because he's the author, and even though he's, he has maybe a bias towards this paper, he can say what is different between the two. You have to unmute, Tim.
Yeah, you're muted. You have to unmute it.
So the main difference between our analysis and theirs is actually, so the most striking one is actually the much larger number of randomized controlled trials. So I think that's a result in itself. So back then there were not many randomized controlled trials, and also to be fair about their analysis, I think their main argument was not about interventions, but it was about observational studies and also the correlation between measured financial literacy and behavior. But what has happened in the academic community, and also when we look at the media headlines, they have been cited for this lack of effect in a very limited and small number of studies. So, and I think people jump to the conclusion that just because there is no evidence of an effect, they take this and say, okay, now this is evidence of no effect. But these two are not the same. So I think by updating the data set to a much larger number of RCTs, that alone is the main difference. And even when we use the exact same method and assumptions, we already have a much larger effect estimate. And the second difference is that we really try to focus our paper now on this one question: does it work on average, or doesn't it? And really try to probe this result. So we really try to also, extend the model to incorporate heterogeneity, because you cannot really observe all of the features that vary. So you can model some of this, but it's probably better to just allow for random variation between the studies. And we also really dug deep into these issues that have not been studied before in detail, like publication selection bias. Could it be that, we just see this because people would like to find that this works, or is this really robust? So that's the main difference between our papers.
I read, for example, some of the questions, and sorry, there are so many I had to, in a sense, run through. And one person asked, why not looking at attitude? Why looking at behavior? And this allows me to say two things. First, behavior is something that, of course, policymakers are really interested in. So, attitude can be more of a mean to the change in behavior. And it's not that there are so many papers about attitude, and it's also hard to look at them. So that's why we focus on behavior, which has been the more standard measure. But as we look ahead, I think it's also important to look at measure of well-being, right? At the end, the ultimate objective of people is not to save more or borrow less, but to be financially secure, to be financially resilient, to be well off. So, we also need to move toward financial well-being. And I know this is an important as well research agenda of the OECD. And of course, to do that, we need to start modeling a little bit more. One of the things we did see, there is a little bit of lack of modeling formally of financial literacy. I mean, I can think of many, by the way, example in which, even if you do financial education, it shouldn't create any change in behavior, right? And it's optimal not to do anything, even if you have financial education. So let's remember that this doesn't, if you do financial education, it doesn't mean that it is optimal to change behavior. So I hope in the next meta-analysis, potentially, we can study also financial well-being.
Mm-hmm. I stumbled upon a question by Jonathan. So he asked, what's the main difference between the findings from this paper and actually the older paper where I am a co-author, Kaiser and Menkhoff 2017. So I have to we glanced over this because this is a very brief presentation. But we put a different emphasis here. So what we tried to do in the earlier paper was that we actually looked at both randomized control trials, but also like quasi-experimental studies, where you could have more like a debate about whether these studies are really internally valid. But since Anna showed the plot that the literature is really growing a lot at a fast pace, we felt that it's time really to look at the fast-growing evidence on randomized controlled trials, which are much more than we had before, and try to really settle this debate on whether it works on average or not. Because you're right, we already had some indication that effects are probably significantly different from zero in randomized controlled trials in our 2017 paper, but this did not keep people from still, citing mainly this earlier paper, and although this was not our main emphasis in the 2017 paper. So we really tried to look at all of the available data from randomized controlled trials and really probe the robustness of this one particular result, because this has been so influential also in the policy debate. We felt that this is a necessary thing to do, and also it's very necessary to update the data here. So that would be the main difference between the two papers.
Some people are asking, and I am very glad to see some of the people in the research committee of the OECD INFE, for example, what is potentially an effect on overconfidence and so on. Because this is a meta-analysis, we have to be very structured, and so we are not able, like in a literature review, in a narrative review, to really look at some of those characteristics. Here is already very hard to assess the effect of financial education just on behavior. And also we are focusing, remember, on the just randomized control trial, which are, of course, a limited number. And so that's why sometimes we are not able to look at this other question that I see, you are being asking, but it's hard enough to already aggregate, and also what financial education mean, and then look at the effect on financial knowledge and on financial behavior.
Mm-hmm. So I just lost the comment that I was going to respond to. Okay, here it is again. So Ellen asks, how do you think behavioral biases influence the budgeting and saving behaviors of consumers? Do you think those biases can be corrected with the help of financial education? This is a great question. I also think that there's some indication that the field is headed this way. So there are lots of great studies that look at treatment effects of financial education programs or other types of educational programs on preferences. And there's some debate on whether financial education may affect time inconsistent decision making, so present bias. There's a great study by Melanie Lührmann and Joachim Winter and co-authors from Germany looking at this. And there's also a study from Turkey, which finds similar results. And I know that there's a lot of large-scale randomized control trials now being studied from Peru and also in Spain. And all of these studies point at a similar direction, that maybe you can foster patience through financial education or try to address some of these biases that are obviously also linked to financial decision-making. But for now, I think we have to somehow concede and also say that there's not more research needed to really understand this mechanism. So we would probably like to think that these programs are effective at increasing financial knowledge or financial literacy, and that this is causing the behavior change. This seems like a plausible mechanism, but it could also be that there's like a direct effect of these interventions, so that you're somehow making people more patient, especially if these are very young children. But it's a bit early to say whether this is what is happening. So I think there's definitely more research needed to really address this finding, the question of the exact mechanisms underlying these behavior changes that we observe.
Yes, and that's actually, I see a lot of questions that, are really related to a survey. If we had done a narrative review, this is a quantitative review, right? So our hands are off, we take all of these studies, we aggregate them and we run the model. So, we cannot look at the mechanism often, what's working, what's behind it. And this is, in a sense, also the beauty of doing this quantitative work, right? I mean, we let, in a sense, the data speak. But I did see another questions coming again from the research committee, which is there a difference between the informal versus formal studies? And thanks, Elsa, for this question. I think, this is something we could actually study. We could split the sample, for example, at looking at financial education program in schools versus, other programs which are a little bit more informal. So this could be a classification that we could do in the future. For some of the other things, what is the mechanism, behind this? We really do not know, because that's not the purpose of the paper, and also that's not what you do necessarily with this type of technique. And, some of the people say, well, we have seen the 5 behavior. So does it mean that we should only teach, in a sense, those topics? That's not what you can infer from these studies. What the study says that, for example, we find a relatively strong effect on the borrowing behavior. And we find a stronger effect on, for example, financial education. But I do think, and this is of course the work of the OECD, that we need to have national standards on financial literacy and financial education. It's not that you should teach only one topic. I think the topic have to cover what is important to teach. And, this is what we do in other fields as well. We just don't teach the topic that's most effective. As in the same time, we don't teach when, you have to know that knowledge. This just-in-time education, I think in our study doesn't find much support for that approach.
I saw a lot of questions related to the RCT from Brazil. So first of all, we obviously included the RCT from Brazil in this evidence. This is also a relatively large-scale experiment. I think it's the second largest experiment. And so this is obviously also the results of this study are reflected in our overall average. So I think there's also sometimes this perception that there are very mixed findings within this study. But just to give you some perspective, for example, on the savings measure, we actually see some treatment effects that are in economic terms indicating that students save about 10 to 11% more of their disposable income. So even within studies, this is one of the advantages of a meta-analysis. If you aggregate all of these different estimates that are present within a single study, you could maybe arrive at a different conclusion than by just reading the abstract or by just discussing selected results that you find curious or flashy. So I think the Brazil study, from my perspective, is more a study that speaks in favor of the effectiveness, but one can always debate on the size of the effects. So lots of questions about Brazil, but yeah, this study is included in our meta-analysis and obviously has a lot of weight in the analysis just to the sheer size it has.
I also see a question, and I have mentioned it, but perhaps not as much. We have 33 countries in the paper, and they are listed in the appendix. So we have lots of developing countries. This study ended up having a coverage of 6 continents. So, for example, contrary to the original paper, which of course had less evidence, we have a lot of countries here, and we were very happy to do so and to see that. And as you see, we also split the evidence across these different countries as well. So, by no means this just covers a small set of countries. It really covers many of them. And it's an important also evidence of just how much this field has expanded and has expanded, in many countries.
I also see questions that I tried to summarize and group now because these are really a lot to read through. So there are questions concerning the question whether there's any evidence or anything you can say about whether it makes sense to target programs at the very young or the elderly. So, but the main takeaway is that, while 76 RCTs sound like a lot of studies, it's a very tough question to really, arrive at the conclusion that one works significantly better than the other. But what we can see is that the effects on financial knowledge are possibly larger when you start with the very young. So for the children, the treatment effects look a bit larger, but this is also a result with some uncertainty around it, obviously. So that would actually speak in favor of, starting early, starting in schools. But then at the same time, obviously the effects on financial behaviors, they seem to be a bit stronger when you are looking at adults, which also makes sense because students typically don't engage in a lot of financial behaviors, and it's also, tougher to measure any change in these behaviors. Whereas, as adults, you may have more opportunity to also really go out and change your behavior in the field, so to speak. So this is what we found, but definitely we didn't find evidence suggesting that the one or the other doesn't work. So overall, it appears to be effective, irrespective of age.
I want to echo what Tim said, because there are, for example, questions about the elderly. Again, we can only do studies if they are reported there. And I want to, look again and point you again to one of the slide and a table in our presentation where we look at different age group. Of course, we are doing the age group much aggregated, older than 25 and so on. And sometimes we are limited by the data we have, but as Tim said, we find a strong effect on knowledge. This time it is the highest among the younger, and I think it is potentially evidence for the importance of financial education in school.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much, both. I have to say that there are plenty more questions, but we somehow need to wrap up pretty soon. So I have a last question for you too, and actually it was, I think, one of the questions asked by some of the attendees. It's more or less what's next. It is a very interesting, important piece of work, but where do you see the financial literacy field heading next? What is the next challenge? What is your next paper?
Yes. We think it's very important to start focusing on financial well-being and on measure of financial well-being. So not just individual behavior. And that's why, for example, we ended with the financial resilience. So one of my favorite measure, for example, to look at is financial fragility. Are people able to face a shock? That can be a very useful indicator. Are people, able to carry debt and able to meet all of their financial obligation? Do they feel financially secure? So I think it's very important that rather than looking at this single behavior, which are a proxy for financial well-being, we start looking at the financial well-being directly. And also, it's very important to look at scale and concentrate on programs which are not only cost effective, but they can be scalable so that we can reach a wide group of the population. And in that sense, I very much recommend studies of financial education in school. School is such a powerful means to reach a very large group of the population. And I want to remind all of you that the PISA data, the third wave of the PISA data has just been issued. So we also have information about the knowledge of these young people. And I think it would be very important, for example, to do program for those countries where we did see large differences or, for example, a low level of financial education. I also think, for example, that program in the workplace, these are ways in which we can reach a large group of the working population. And so these are very promising ways, I think, in which we can advance the field and understand a lot more, not only how we can do financial education, but in the places and in the ways that is most effective and affects people's lives.
Thank you very much, Anna. Tim?
So I think I agree with Anna that there needs to be a shift in attention, maybe also within the outcome. So we now have established that it's possible to somehow induce behavior change via educational interventions. So there's also a lot of heterogeneity that we cannot really explain. So there's large unexplained heterogeneity, but that's what we can conclude. But you could easily make the case that just by inducing behavior change alone, you don't really know whether this is increasing well-being or even household welfare. So I would like to see more work that's grounded in theory and has a clear theoretical frameworks why behavior change may be beneficial in certain instances. And also, I agree that we need probably more large-scale evaluations of programs operated in scale. So studies like the one in Peru by Veronica Frisancho or from Brazil, these are large-scale programs implemented by actual policymakers and not some small-scale pilot. So I think this is very important to learn from these experiences. So what happens when you implement these kind of policies? And I think the final thing would be that it's also good to consider whether we can maybe get better data to measure behavior change or welfare increases. So much of this evidence obviously relies on survey data, and that comes with limitations. So I think it would be fascinating to see some studies that involve administrative data and account data. So there's maybe some room for improvement in collaborating with the private sector to try to really get like this proprietary data and have it anonymized and use it for research. So I think these are things, or yeah, I would love to see more large-scale evaluations, possibly using the PISA data set to try to find a clever way of evaluating changes of policies within countries and timing this with the PISA financial literacy assessment and using this to measure progress. So I think these are all areas that are relevant, and I think that's where we need to head in this concerned with impact evaluation of programs.
Thank you very much, both of you. And I'd like to say that I very much agree with, focusing on financial well-being. As Anna said, I don't think we are interested in people necessarily saving more or borrowing less. We're interested in them being financially better in a sense. And financial well-being is indeed a focus, of course, of the work of the OECD in the past, and we will continue doing that. And then I very much agree also to look at environment, schools, workplace. We are also doing a lot of work on this. But anyway, thank you both. It's been extremely informative. I think it will be really key for the future in terms of the financial literacy community, policymakers, researchers alike, the private sector, I'm quite sure. So thank you very much for this. Again, I'd like to repeat that the presentation and the recording of the webinar will be available on our website. And I also have to announce that we will have the next webinar on the 25th of June. We will actually release the global survey on financial literacy of adults. So, well, save the day, 25th of June, and we'll have more with the research community and of course with members of the INPI. So thank you very much. I'm closing the webinar now. I hope you're all safe, and I'll see you soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.